Hi everyone, and welcome to today's video in which I'm going to introduce yet another cosplay in the line of I absolutely do not have a type. So, of course it's another villain. As a kid I watched the Hunchback of Notre Dame once and then didn't for a really long time, because as a kid I was really scared of fire. And that movie contains quite a lot of fire. But we recently watched it again and I fell in love with it, and it's now one of my favorite Disney movies. One of the big reasons why I love it so much is because of Frollo. He is such a scary villain because he is so real. And the biggest example of that is in Hellfire. He is being given ways out, but he refuses to take it because he has just such a tunnel vision, and that's what makes him such a good villain. I mean, he is a fictional character, yes, but he's just so real. And he's not based on an actual person, but he's based on... I mean, you can still see people doing things like this all the time. But regardless, because he is such a real character and I love the way what Disney did with him, I'm going to add him to my villain lineup. What I am going to do, however, is I'm going to slightly gender bend him. Reason being, he's an old dude with quite interesting facial structure, and I don't really feel like wearing a full mask, which is what I should be doing if I want to properly cosplay him. So what I'm going to do instead is slightly gender bend him. How we're going to do that exactly, I'll figure out at some later time. First of all, we're going to start with the biggest part of his outfit, which is gown that he wears. I'm not really going to change much about that for the gender bending part. When I was looking at the gown and at patterns that are similar, I actually ended up with a houppelande, the medieval garment. It's quite useful for that. So I bought Daisy Victoria's houppelande pattern, and I'm going to adjust that to suit my needs for Frollo. This pattern is quite new for me to work with because it's a draft it yourself pattern based on your own measurements. So I'm not going to note down exactly all of that, because then I would basically give you guys the entire tutorial and I don't want that. If you like the garment that I make with it and you want to make something like it, do check out Daisy Victoria's houppelande pattern. It also includes a lot of information about the garment and it's a really interesting read in general. So I think that was plenty of an introduction. It has taken long enough, and without further ado, let's start crafting. My fabric is all rolled out on the table. I've got my notes with my measurements here, and the tutorial is on my computer screen, so we can start drafting. Because this is a very loose garment, the exact measurements don't matter as much, and I'm just randomly choosing some stuff, such as the curve of the bottom hem. This is my first time drafting an arm size, so I have no idea what curve I'm going for exactly, but this does look somewhat like the picture, so let's just roll with this. The back side is a lot quicker. Since the back and the front of my version are the same, I can just lay the front on the fabric and cut around the outline. I will flip it around this time to have less wastage. For the sleeves, I decided the width at the wrist by just hanging a tape measure from my wrist and seeing what I liked. That turned out to be around 40 centimeters. Again, we can flip this after cutting for the other half. Because of the way that Frollo's dress hangs, I decided to cut the front and the back on the fold line, so I won't have a center seam, because looking at the pictures I don't think there should be a center seam there. This does however mean that with the very first step of sewing everything together, namely the shoulder seams, I also have to make a neckline, because that's not in there for me yet. I want the neckline to be quite wide, and I got to this measurement by measuring my entire shoulder width and then dividing it by half, because, well, it was on the fold when I cut it. And after that I measured the distance from the shoulder to my neck and took it a bit wide, which means that my shoulder is slightly on the shorter side, but that's good because I want a really wide neckline. And that measurement was 10 centimeters, so we can just put that on here. Which means that for the shoulder right now I only have to sew those parts. Then I'll fit it and see if I need to make it any tighter, aka sew a bit more or not. With just the shoulder seams attached, I can already start looking at the fit, and honestly, I already love the way that it hangs. I quite like that. But for now, we have to start looking at the way that I want the neckline to be. I checked some more reference images, and I actually realized that it's a really square, really large neckline of the thing that he wears underneath. So we'll have to make this a lot wider. And these shoulder seams should probably be a lot shorter than the 10 centimeters I currently have. So anyway, I can slowly start pinning what I like. It's quite low, but he will have the, yeah, I still don't know what it is, the shoulder plate thing over it. And I definitely don't want this thing to peek out above that. So we're going to make the neckline rather wide and, well, square. I probably want the corner to be around here. I also don't want it to fall off my shoulder, so I shouldn't make it too wide. I think somewhere here will be nice. And I'll see about the back, because that's slightly more difficult to pin, so I'll just make something comparable to the front. So let's now see if we can make a nice square neckline out of this. After mirroring the pins and tracing a line between them, this is what I came up with for the neckline. I also took another look at the reference images, and it differs per image, per animation thing, whether it's a square neckline or a more round neckline. To make my life a bit easier, I decided to go for the round neckline. Also because when you're wearing the full costume, this neckline will not be seen that often anyway. So I have traced a line, which means that I can now, again with a seam allowance of 2 centimeters, cut out this line. And I'm going to cut through the front and the back, because again, if you look at the reference images, the neckline is rather deep on the back as well. So let's do that. Seeing as this fabric doesn't fray too much, I'm going to actually finish the neckline at a later time, when I actually know what I'm going to be doing there. But I will cut short the shoulder seams, zigzag them, and iron them towards what I guess from now on will be the back. As I cut the sleeves in the front and the back part, we are first going to sew the sleeve together on the top side. Now that the sleeves are together, it's also time to start thinking about how to finish the seams, which made me realize that when you look at the reference images and you look inside his sleeve, you can see some red lining. But I haven't thought about that yet, so let's see if in my giant box of linings that I inherited from my grandma, if we have some red lining that we can use. You might recognize this one. But I found 2 red linings that might be usable for this. This one is definitely red, but it's ridiculously synthetic and it pretty much just feels horrible. Or I have this, which feels really nice, but it's slightly less red. However, I think compared to the black and purple, it will still read as red. And considering how big of a pile this is, I think this should be enough to fix some lining for our sleeves. There we go. I have a feeling this might be actually rather expensive fabric. but there's plenty for sleeves and maybe a few more jackets, and so no worries about that. What I'm going to do for at least one of the sleeves is cut it at the fold so that I don't have to sew this in. And I'm cutting it with a slight bit of overlap so the lining won't be too tight in the sleeve. The second lining was cut in 2 pieces to conserve a bit of fabric. You will hardly be able to see the seam anyway. So my parents were here yesterday, and of course I showed some of the stuff that I was working on, and then my mom managed to tell me that this lining fabric is the fabric that my grandma used to make my dad's wedding jacket. His wedding suit was lined with this fabric, which makes it all the more fun to actually use this now in a costume. I mean, there was actually quite a bit left, even after this, so I might be able to make some more stuff out of it. But yeah, stories like that make it even more fun to work with random stash fabric. Next up, we can pin the sleeves into the armholes. I'm going to pin both the outside and lining fabric at the same time. Because you have to attach the curved sleeve into the relatively straight armhole, it is a bit finicky, but with some fiddling around, still pretty doable. The trick is to use plenty of pins. Then the front is folded over at the shoulder seams. And both the underside of the arms and side seam are pinned in one go as one big seam. Somewhere halfway along the line of sewing the long side and sleeve seam did I realize that I made a small mistake. Considering we have a sleeve with lining, you would expect that if you open up the seam, you would not see the seam allowance at all, like here at the top. However, because we just folded everything over and sewn it in one go, we have the seam allowance here, which I could have prevented if I would have inserted the lining after sewing the entire thing together, but honestly, I don't think it's worth of unpicking everything and redoing that. Also because I already cut off and finished the seam allowance in where I attached the sleeve. But anyway, I guess I'll just cut this short and finish it neatly, and we'll just call it. I mean, you probably won't see much of it anyway, as there will also be a purple band here at the end that will cover up the first 5 centimeters or so. So only if the sleeve is opened very far will you sort of be able to see that there is seam allowance in there. So yeah, not the nicest and prettiest thing, but meh, we'll make mistakes somewhere along the way. At first I had the idea to do the bottom hem by folding the fabric over twice. It was quite a bit of work pinning and folding it. And this is why you check your reference images while working, because after finishing the entire bottom hem, I found out that this also needs a purple strip. So let me unpick all of this again. So, after unpicking nearly 4 meters of hem, we can decide what we want to do for that bottom band. I bought this purple fabric also for the accent at the sleeves, and looking at the reference images, because of the way that the Hunchback of the Notre Dame was animated, this varies in width. So I grabbed my small ruler and I just played around with widths until I found something that I liked, and I probably want it to be 8 centimeters wide. That makes for a nice wide band around the entire bottom. Which means that I can easily cut 10 centimeters and fold it over at the top and fold it over at the bottom by 1 centimeter, leaving, well, 8 centimeters. So I am going to be cutting 4 meters of 10 centimeter wide strip, and well, of course that can't be done from one single strip, so I'll have to cut a few of these strips, sew them together, and then we can attach them to the bottom hem. don't know what's wrong with me today, but apparently I made a measuring mistake somewhere. I thought one half of the seam would be longer than 1.40 meters, but apparently it's shorter. So what I am going to do is I'm going to cut it off here so that the seam of the lower band is actually on the same height as the seam of the side, because that's of course a lot prettier than having seams somewhere randomly. So I will unpick this and restitch it at the seam line. After stitching the band together and sewing it on the bottom, we can iron it towards the outside. To make sure it was rolled over properly and you wouldn't see the black peek out underneath, I added some pins. After that, we can fold over the top edge of the band and pin it in place. Because this is all the way at the bottom hem, I stitch it on by machine, as it isn't too noticeable. For the sleeves we are going to use a folded band, so I cut it twice as wide. For me that was 16 centimeters. After ironing it double, I attached it to the inside of the sleeve with the machine. After that, it could be flipped and ironed over, and then folded in half so it covers the outside. The edge can be turned to the inside and was attached to just the outside fabric by hand. When hand sewing the band on the outside, I realized it might have been better to do it the other way around, which is what I did for the other sleeve. So sew it to the outside, then fold to the inside and hand sew it to the lining. If there's a really big difference between the two sleeves, I might redo this for the first sleeve. But let's just finish it first. With the sleeve bands attached, we are actually already done. There we go, one Frollo gown. And I am really happy with how this turned out, especially the sleeves. I mean, these long sleeves with the purple bands. It's the perfect Disney villain feeling. I'm also really happy with how the lining turned out. It's definitely there. If it moves around, it is visible, but it's still quite subtle. For the neckline, I am wearing a t-shirt underneath, so the neckline actually starts here. And I'm going to finish that once I know what we're actually going to do here with the shoulder armor pads thing. That's for a later time. I am also really happy with how flowy it is, and I think it works perfectly. So yeah, it does pretty well convey the Disney villain feeling, if I may say so myself. And with this done, we can start on the rest of the Frollo cosplay, but that will be for another video. If you liked this, you can subscribe. If you really liked it, you can support my crafting addiction on Ko-Fi. And with that, I hope you all enjoyed watching. See you next time.